Hi readers, welcome to a new unit. We're going to be exploring a genre that might be kind of unfamiliar to you. I know in my classroom we haven't had a ton of exposure or experience with poetry, so I'm really excited to learn a new type of text with you guys. So sometimes when things are new, they might feel intimidating and we might feel like we don't really understand. So I wanted to spend today giving you some tools and strategies that can help you understand poetry and really just enjoy it more. So we're going to talk about the types of poetry, which are going to help us kind of know what to expect from a poet, which is what we call authors who write poetry. And then we're going to talk about the elements of a poem. So just kind of looking at it and saying, okay, what are the different pieces here? And what does that mean? And that will really help us read our poem in the way that it was intended by the poet. So let's talk types of poetry. Poems can be narrative, and that would mean that the author is writing a poem to tell us a story. Now, the good news is with a narrative story is it's going to follow the same predictable pattern. With a narrative poem, it's going to follow the same predictable pattern that a narrative story follows. So remember that mountain where we travel with the character, we meet them in the beginning in their setting, and they have all these challenges, and then at the moment of the most tension, that's the climax, and then they tie up all these loose ends in the falling action to resolve everything at the end. Well, a narrative poem is going to follow the exact same pattern. So that part's definitely going to feel familiar to us. Sometimes poets will write a descriptive poem, and that is when the poet is trying to create a mental movie in our minds, right? A very detailed mental picture, and we call it visualizing. And again, that's something that's new for us. Oftentimes in poetry, we'll call that the use of imagery, right? Our poets are using words to create images for us. Authors also write lyrical poems, which are really kind of they're expressing their own emotions through poems, and they are writing with such detail that sometimes that will invoke the same emotion or feeling in us. So lots of times song lyrics, get it, lyrical, song lyrics are, we would consider lyrical poems. Sometimes authors write to make us giggle, right? And to be super silly and to poke fun at things. So that would be a humorous type of poem. I find this one to be pretty familiar with third graders and very enjoyable. A poet named Shel Silverstein writes. His type of poem is humorous poems. And then there is a type of poem called free verse. And authors can use free verse for many, many different reasons. There's no real format to free verse. There aren't any rules. You don't have to rhyme when you're writing in free verse. And so a free verse poet could be writing to have you think about life or to tell a story, right? Similar to a narrative. So now that we understand why authors would choose poems and what we can expect their purpose to be, let's talk about the parts of a poem. So you're going to have a stanza, and within a stanza in a poem are going to be line and line breaks. So a stanza reminds me of a paragraph or a section of a passage that I'm reading. And I'll show you what all of these look like in just a moment. And then you'll have lines within the stanza, and you'll have line breaks, right, where one line ends and another begins. The kind of cool thing about poetry is that you don't have to be at the end of your thought to start a new line. So you don't have to add ending punctuation. You can just end your line at one spot. And then if that's not where your thought ends, you just start it at the next spot. And I'll show you kind of why a poet wouldn't finish their thought in just one line. And then wherever that line ends, we would call that the line break. Oftentimes poems rhyme, and we'll talk about different types of rhyming patterns that we might see. You don't have to have rhymes to consider it a poem. Remember, I talked to you about that free verse. And then, of course, there could be repetition in a poem, and that's when the poet is, either trying to draw our attention to a specific theme or trying to add to kind of the feeling that we have as we're reading it, if we're doing some repetition. And then there's white space, and the white space is kind of partners up with our stanzas and lines because poets don't have to finish their thought in one line. There ends up being some white space on the side of the poem, and that's on purpose. When we are writing a narrative or informative, or even with your persuasive speeches, like, we just kept typing and writing until we got to the end of the line, and then we would start again in the next line. But with poetry, you have a little bit more freedom to end your lines where you would like to, which creates some white space to the side. And all of these things are done intentionally by the poet to create a specific rhythm as we read it, right? Okay, let me show you what all of this means in a poem that you are actually going to be listening to and practicing reading on your own after you're done listening to me. So this is kind of a silly poem. The author's purpose is definitely to make us giggle. And it's called Homework, Oh Homework. And here you can see, remember when I said a stanza reminds me of a paragraph or a section? That's what this is at the top, right? It's a group of lines. It's, there's clearly space below and on top of it to kind of separate it. And then within a stanza are the different lines of the poem. So this particular stanza has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines. And you'll notice that the author doesn't always end their thought, the poet doesn't always end their thought before going to the next line. So that's what we would call our line breaks. Then I found with this particular poem that it did have some examples of rhyming: stink, sink, bits, fits. It also had repetition. I see homework, oh homework once, twice, and then it's going to actually repeat in the third stanza too. So that's the author kind of bringing us back to our theme, and it's also going to help me when I'm trying to find my rhythm with this poem. You can see some of the white space here, and there's actually white space up here as well. I used it to add my elements of poetry notes, but that also helps me know when to stop reading. It adds to that rhythm element of it. So if I'm taking all of this into consideration, if I know that just because I get to the end of the line doesn't mean that I'm done with the thought, if I pay attention to the rhymes and the stanzas, then you'll notice a difference in the way that I read it, right? Here's paying attention to the different elements of poetry. Homework, oh homework, I hate you, you stink. I wish I could wash you away in the sink. If only a bomb would explode you to bits. Homework, oh homework, you're giving me fits. Right? Notice how I was able to put a little bit of emphasis on the rhyming words, how I tried to read the repeating lines with the same tone. So thanks to the poet for giving me these clues so that I could read it with the expression that was intended. I just have one more announcement I wanted to make. This is one of the read alouds your teacher's going to be sharing with you whenever you're at school. And this is an example of one of those free verse poems. And the poet is telling you a story. And it's definitely got some funny moments in it. And you're going to learn even more about poetry as you listen to this. So just on your first day, you guys, you have already been exposed to humorous and free verse poems, and hopefully you've enjoyed both of them. All right, you're going to listen to Homework, Oh Homework another time and answer some questions about poetry. See you soon.